Hi everyone. I'm making this video for anybody who may be on the fence about whether they want to join one of our habitat builds on First Nations territory. I'm mainly talking about my team build in June of 2024, but really this information applies to any similar Indigenous build. What I'm going to do is address some of the concerns I've heard for why people may feel like they don't want to come along, and then give some of the very good reasons why I think people should join us. I would have just sent out a lengthy email to the people interested, but nobody would want to read an email that long. So I'm hoping that this video format will be somewhat more palatable. Before I do anything else, I should thank everybody for being interested enough to watch. Even if it doesn't make you want to say yes, I appreciate you taking the time to watch. Let me start with reason one why I've heard for not coming. I don't have time. I know everybody's busy, and lots of you have families to care for, but I've made this as flexible as I can. I realize you have to take a couple of days off work or use a couple of vacation days, but I booked the site for Monday, June 17th through Thursday, June 20th, 2024. I'm offering people the option to stay for a 2-day build, Monday and Tuesday, or Wednesday and Thursday, or to stay for all 4 days. I'll be there for all 4, and several other people have already mentioned to me that they want to stay for all 4, but I'll leave that entirely up to you. So I'm as flexible as possible to allow people to fit this into their schedule. Reason 2 I've heard for not coming is that you feel you're not physically capable of contributing. And make no mistake, this is a very legitimate concern. However, you may be able to do more than you think. It's true that you need to be mobile enough to safely maneuver around the job site, and the tasks required are physical of varying levels, but the habitat team is very good at finding tasks for varying abilities. On the previous teams, we've had people from 19 to 80, just about every physical type, both genders. Last year we even had a grandma-granddaughter duo along on the trip. How cool is that? If you're capable of helping in any way, the habitat team and myself will find ways that you can contribute. I guess in essence, what I'm saying is don't assume that you can't do it. If you feel like joining us, talk to me directly, and we'll see if we can address those concerns. And maybe I'll agree that it's not a good idea and that this is not for you. But equally likely, I'll be able to give you some examples of where you might be able to chip in if you do join us. Reason 3 I've heard for not coming is financial. As I mentioned before, it does require a couple of days off work. And if you've been on a Habitat Global Village build before, or if you've looked into that, you realize that going on one of those requires an investment of several $1,000s. And even some builds in Canada will require an investment of a couple of thousand for a week-long build. It's one of the reasons why I offer 2-day or 4-day builds, and I work very hard at keeping costs down so that anybody can afford to participate. Last year, each participant paid $300 for their 2-day build, which covered overnight accommodations and our dinners. Lunches are provided by Habitat on site. And I'll be working very hard to maintain that pricing for this year. Those staying for 4 days will pay proportionately more. But it's worth noting that one of the things that will happen very early on in the process if you sign up for the build is that a fundraising portal will be created for those who want it, which allows your friends, your family, your church, your employer, etc., to help out with the cost. Last year, with the fundraising we did and everybody's registration fee, after expenses were all paid, we left a donation of more than $5,000 with Habitat Grey Bruce to continue their good work. So hopefully those 3 points address some of the reasons for not coming. Now let's look at the reasons for coming. I'm going to start with a little bit of history because it's important for context. I did 3 overseas builds first. The first was in 2015 on Bantayan in the Philippines, then 2016 in New Delhi, India, and 2017 in southeastern Nepal. All spectacular builds, working with habitat teams alongside the locals. I probably would have continued along that path of doing annual overseas builds, but I decided to book my 2018 trip along with a family friend in memory of my dad, who was the proudest of proud Canadians. So we stayed in Canada and booked a build at Curve Lake First Nation in his memory. And that was hugely eye-opening to see what was really third world conditions here in our own country. Our team leader on that build had been with my team in the Philippines and has led teams all over the world. So he had arranged time. He had arranged study materials for before we went, so we were prepared. And then he had arranged time to spend with band leadership and the eventual homeowners while we were on the build. And all of that led us to understand the culture a wee bit more and encouraged us to become part of the solution. We've all heard the word reconciliation bantered about, but educating yourself and then spending time on First Nations land with First Nations people brings it much more sharply into focus. In 2019, I joined the same Habitat team leaders on a build in Chippawas of Nawash, Unceded First Nation, and it was just as eye-opening. It also introduced me, importantly, to the well-run, well-equipped Habitat team in the Grey Bruce region and their partnership of hope with the local First Nations, all of which are a big part of what keeps bringing me back to that region. And that's where we'll be going back to in June of 2024. After that 2019 build, of course, we had all plans put on hold for a while because of the pandemic. But then in June of 2022, when things opened up again, I took a team of 8, family and friends, for a day of building with the same Habitat group, but this time at Saugeen First Nation, the day before Indigenous Peoples Day in Canada. I should explain that. I always want to be there helping as close as possible to Indigenous Peoples Day, which always falls on June 21st. It just feels like an appropriate way to mark that date. In June of 2023, I led a team of 25 family, friends, former colleagues, and church folk on a 2-day build in Saugeen First Nation, again, just before Indigenous Peoples Day. The overnight stay meant that we had the opportunity to share dinner and then share time together, talking about expectations and sharing stories and our experiences of the day. That's enormously important and enormously impactful. And it's one of the things that my Habitat mentor taught me to make time for. Having that sharing time is one of the reasons why a multi-day build is so very special. In September of 2023, I was part of a team of 9 that spent a week back up in the Grey Bruce region, part of which was spent with Chippawas and Nawash, and which included a lot of time strengthening our relationship with the band leadership there. That will be of considerable importance when we go back up in June of 2024, since I'm sure that we'll be able to have members from the band council come by and explain to us in person just what it means to them, what we're doing. All of these builds on First Nations territory, together with our studies leading up to the builds, have been, as I keep saying, profoundly eye-opening. One of the study resources that I strongly recommend to anybody looking at joining a build on First Nations territory, or for that matter, anybody else in Canada, is the online 4 Seasons of Reconciliation course that was produced in collaboration with First Nations University of Canada. A bunch of us from my church took it a few years ago from the Rutherford Foundation. And some of my teammates who were headed up with me to Saugeen First Nation took it specifically in preparation for the build. My friend and Habitat mentor, Ken Rutherford, has coined a great phrase to summarize his approach to First Nations relationships on these builds. And it's the approach I've learned to try and adopt as well. He calls it the 3 E's of reconciliation. Those are empowerment, experience, and education. We should all start with education, of course, and there's a lot of great material out there if we just take the time. That should start, of course, with the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. But there's also some great study resources like the book, Whose Land Is It Anyway? Decolonization Handbook, and a collection of essays called Survivors Speak. And, of course, the 4 Seasons of Reconciliation course that I mentioned earlier. The empowerment part of the 3 E's is twofold, really. We want to empower our build teammates to go out from the build and spread the word about what they've seen and done and what reconciliation has come to mean to them as a result. But we also want to empower our First Nations brethren to live their best lives. And addressing housing on First Nations territory plays a very big role in that, particularly for the children who will grow up in those houses. As I said before, much of the housing is more like that of a third world nation, and that is simply unacceptable in this great country of ours. And finally, the experience part of that, the last E, is self-evident, but it bears some clarifying. Obviously, working alongside First Nations peoples on these builds is eye-opening, but it's also a hugely important part of putting reconciliation into action. It's an experience I can't recommend strongly enough. Talking and learning about reconciliation is important, but sometimes putting it into action means putting on work boots and a hard hat and going out and actually pitching in. Now, whenever you go off to do a First Nations build, or go overseas for that matter, there's a very real danger of considering ourselves to be the white saviors going off to save the poor natives. But that's one of the beauties of the 3E approach. As soon as you start the education portion, you soon come to realize that the First Nations people here are not the poor relatives of our Canadian family. That's a white colonial attitude in play. Educating ourselves means recognizing at the time we settlers arrived here on Turtle Island, there were fully formed communities and nations amounting to more than 8 million people. By some accounts, many times that number. And they had been here for thousands of years. We didn't discover this land at all, and we certainly didn't bring civilization to the poor natives. What we gifted to them instead was broken treaties, reservations, and residential schools, and diseases like smallpox and measles, and pollution, and so on and so on. We could have and should have learned so much from them about living in balance with the land instead of trying to conquer it, but that was surely not the colonial approach. As soon as you take off the blinders and realize how far off the rails we took the relationship with our First Nations peoples, you see the need for the experience and empowerment parts of the reconciliation story to help balance the scales. I like this quote from Abel Boson, one-time Grand Chief of the Cree Nation. He put it like this: "For me, reconciliation is about resetting the button. For me, it's about looking at the past, acknowledging that we made mistakes in the past in all the different sectors, and resetting that button and starting to work together." So there you go. That's kind of my sales pitch to encourage people to join us. It's important work. It's valuable work. It's satisfying work. And it's work I intend to keep doing for as long as I am physically able. For me, it's an act of reconciliation. For my church family that joined me on the last build, my friend and minister Bill Thomas said it really eloquently. He said, "This is a chance to live the gospel we proclaim." For the non-church folk who join us, maybe it's expressed as simply as, "Put your money where your mouth is." We all talk about reconciliation, and maybe you've taken the steps to learn the lessons, but this is an opportunity to actually go out and put it into action. So one final point. I think we all recognize the value that Habitat for Humanity brings to our own communities. And I urge everybody to chip in there as well. But there's something special about traveling to a First Nations community to help the efforts there. Yes, it's about putting reconciliation into action and all the things I've already talked about. But I also feel like doing it some distance away from home means that you have to invest a little extra time and effort to get there. And that adds just an extra layer of significance to the whole thing. And if you can join a multi-day build, as I said before, there's more opportunities for sharing stories and experiences. And that adds to the impact of the build on both the participants and the community where you'll be working. If any of that catches your interest and you want to discuss it further, I am more than happy to do that. And if you decide you want to join one of my teams in the future, I'm happy to discuss that as well. I promise it's not something that you will regret. So thank you for taking the time to listen. If you want to get in touch, my email address will be in the video description, or for those that know me personally, come and talk to me. I'm happy to discuss this at some length. So I hope to see you all on Build One Day, and thank you for listening. Bye now.